Today I'd like to talk about how we can create single-page applications using Angular.js and its routing capabilities. So what is a single-page application? Simply put, it is an application with a single web page. Any new content that a user requests is dynamically loaded into that single page. Many times, single-page applications also provide the perception that a user is navigating to different URLs within the site. However, through the HTML5 history API or URL hash fragments, we are able to manipulate the URL without triggering a page reload. One of the goals of single-page applications is to provide a more fluid user experience similar to desktop applications. Because we are not re-requesting common parts of the site, like the header, navigation, and footer, whenever we want to see new content, the user experience is much faster. Let's look at an example. So here I have a sample blog application with 3 different routes, a home route, an about route, and a particular route for a single blog entry. And as you can see, as I browse between the 3 different links, you'll notice that the URL is changing, but there is no full page refresh. We are simply manipulating the URL hash fragment and dynamically injecting content in this middle portion of the page. And so this is an example of a single page application. So the first thing that we need to do in order to take advantage of Angular's routing capabilities is download the ng route module. And we can do this from the home page. You can click on the download button under extras, and there's this Angular route file that we need to incorporate. So here's a blank version of that blog application that we're going to recreate from scratch. At the bottom of the page, I have 3 scripts: the Angular script, the Angular route script, and our own custom external JavaScript file. Looking at the HTML, I have the main container div, which contains a header, a middle section, which is where all the dynamic content will be injected into, and a footer. So let's get started. In this main.js file, I have created an Angular module called blog. We've set the blog using the ng app directive inside of our HTML. Now we're ready to get started. So the first thing that I want to do is include the ng route module into my own blog module. And the way we do that is by passing ng route as a dependency to this module. So now that I've created my Angular module, let's go ahead and set up all the different routes. So we can run a function called config, and inside this config function we can basically set up the different routes. And so this callback function takes a dependency called route provider. So this route provider is basically a service where we can set up all the different routes in this single page application. So we can call route provider, and I'm going to separate this out onto a different line. And the first function that we're going to call is when. So when we hit the root of our application, which is represented by a slash, we want to load up a particular set of HTML. So in this case, I've actually set up all the different HTML inside a folder called partials. If we look at it, we have an index.html file, which is just a snippet of HTML that we want injected into that middle section of our site. We also have the same thing for the about page. So when I hit the root of the application, let's load up that index.html partial. So the way we can do that is we can say template URL, and we can provide it the path to that partial. So partials/index.html. Let's go ahead and set up the same thing for the about route. So when I hit /about, I want the template URL to be partials/about.html. Great, and now let's go ahead and try this in the browser. Load up the page, go to home, nothing works. Hit about, nothing works, but we can see the actual URL being manipulated. So why doesn't it work? Well, if we look at our routes, we've set up the right templates and we've set up the right routes, but Angular has no idea where do we want this HTML to be injected into. We know that we want to inject this within this middle div. So how do we tell this div that we want the HTML injected inside of it? Well, there's a directive for that. The directive is called ngView. So by setting up this directive, now Angular knows that whenever we hit this route, any HTML in this partial will be injected into this div. Great, so when we load up the page and we go to about, we notice that the about partial was injected into the middle. We go to home and we see the same exact thing. Now what happens if a user types in a bogus URL? Well, we want to be able to handle that. And so there's another function that we can chain to this route provider called otherwise. So otherwise, let's go ahead and redirect to another route. And so we can use the redirect to property, and we want to just redirect to slash. We'll type some gibberish into the URL, and great, we can see that we're redirected back to the home route. Now what if we wanted a controller to manage this chunk of HTML? Say we have some data from a database, a series of blog entries, and we wanted to display that on this index.html partial. Well, we'd probably use the HTTP service, go get the blog post, and attach this data to the scope so that it can be rendered in this partial chunk of HTML. So we need a way of specifying a controller for this particular template. And so this Angular routing actually makes this really easy. We can use a property called controller and give it the name of the controller that we want to control this HTML partial. So we'll call this home controller. And now we need to go ahead and define that controller. So as before, we're going to call app.controller, pass it a function, which accepts a scope object. And now we can attach some data to this. So for now, we can just hard code some data onto the scope. We could say scope.blog entries, and we can just say it's an array of objects. Great, so now I have an array of blog objects attached to the scope. So let's go ahead and iterate over this array and display all of these entries inside of my HTML partial. So I'm going to go back, and I'm just going to create an unordered list. And now we can just use the entry repeat as always. We could say blog in blog entries. Now let's just display one of these pieces of data. So we can say blog.name, and we can do another data binding expression, blog.createdAt. Let's go ahead and view this in the browser. And it looks like we have an error. Looks like I forgot the comma. Great, now we can see all the different blog entries being displayed on the page. So let's go ahead and set up another controller for the about route. We'll say controller, about controller. Pass in a function that accepts a scope. And I'll just set some data to this. So scope.name is equal to David Tang. Scope.age is equal to 28. So we can open up this about partial, and we'll just make this data dynamic. Name, age. And now we can see we get the same exact result, but this data is being dynamic from our controller. So far we've set up routes that are pretty static. Each of these routes don't really have any variables contained within them. If you've ever looked at common blogs, you may see something in the URL like /blog/1, where 1 represents the ID of a particular blog entry, and that number usually changes as you browse through the different blog entries. So let's go ahead and try and set up something similar, where some of the data in the URL is dynamic. So the first thing I'm going to do is go back to my blog entries data, and I'm going to create a property called ID. So we're going to change these so we'll have ID 1, 2, and 3. Now when we go back to this index.html partial, I want to display this within an anchor tag. So now I want to wrap the text within the list item with an anchor tag. So I'm going to say ahref, and we're going to say the URL is going to be /blog/ and the particular ID. So we can use a data binding expression and access that ID attribute. The next thing that we need to do is set up the route for an individual blog entry. If I go back to my route provider, I'm going to create another route, and this time it's going to be /blogs/ and now we want a variable in this URL to represent a specific blog ID. So we can do this by using the colon and the variable name. So $ID. We're going to specify a specific template URL. In this case, it will be partials/blog.html. Let's go ahead and create that partial. So now I want to have a controller that will control this partial of HTML. So I'll assign it a controller, and I'm going to call this blog entry controller. So let's go ahead and set up that controller. Now, how do we access the specific ID from this controller? Well, there's another service that Angular provides called route params. And this route params is basically an object that contains all the different URL parameters that get passed to our route. So in this case, we've defined a route parameter called ID. And so we can access this by calling routeparams.id. So if we had other parameters in the URL, we could access it by routeparams. And then the URL parameter name. But in this case, we only have one for ID. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to attach this ID to scope. So I'll say scope.id is equal to routeparams.id, and I'll also log it to the console. And now I want to display this ID inside of our blog HTML partial. So let's just say blog entry, and now we can say ID. We've created a data binding expression, so this ID will be reflected from what is on the scope. Let's try this in the browser. Now if I see all of my links, if we look at the URLs, we can see that we see /blog/1, 2, and 3, which is what we want. If we click on one of these, we can see blog entry 2, go back to home, blog entry 1, and blog entry 3. So we can see that this is actually getting bound, and we can see that we're pulling the ID from the URL through the route params object. So that is an overview of how we can use Angular's ng route module to create routes in our single page application.